As you know, Jim is the author, and by the way, we're not going to give you a copy of your book, the author of The History of the City Club. Jim did that wonderful book, which we give out to most of our speakers. And Jim has written several books, one actually dealing with corruption in Chicago. My God, I don't know how he found the research myself. It must have been, that's why his hair has got a little thin, because he was pulling his hair out trying to find any kind of things to write about. But his new book on Governor Ryan, is it out yet, Jim, or is it coming out? It's out. As I said, here it is. Well, this book looks very, yes, here's the copy of the book. All right. SIU Press, I can tell by the back. I've done a few books for them, and the back never changes. But the front does. And Jim did a fine job, and, primo veritas. I had a little bit to do, a scant thing to do with this. And I just think that I have read the manuscript, and I think it's a fair, unbiased account of the governor and what happened. So without any more stuff from me, it is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker. Oh, by the way, before we do it, Jim, on your table you have the official questions to hand out. And just because we have a former first assistant U.S. attorney, he will not see the questions afterwards. I will rip them up. They will not be used for evidence. My pleasure to introduce Jim Merriner.
Thank you, Paul. It's been my secret ambition for years to be introduced by Paul Green and Jay Doherty, so now I can retire. Well, and I appreciate your being here, because while you're listening to me, your stocks are going down another 100 points. Maybe you don't want to think about that. I'll tell you a little bit about how this book came to be written. Looking over the room, I see you're all too young to remember Burt Lance. He was President Carter's budget director, and he was forced to resign for some unethical banking deals, and I was political editor of the Atlanta Constitution at the time, and so off the record, he says, look, if they come after you, they're going to get you. You're powerless against the United States Justice Department. And I didn't really agree. I thought, well, Burt, that's your self-vindication. So in 1980, I came to work for the Sun-Times, but shortly before I left Atlanta, an Atlanta alderman was indicted for some infraction of the election laws, and it was front page news, of course. Then I came, shortly after coming to Chicago, a Chicago alderman was indicted for something or other, and it didn't even make the front page. I went up to my editor, I said, are aldermen getting indicted, routine news around here? And he's, corruption we can believe in. So years pass, and I write a biography of Danny Rostenkowski, and he tells me the same thing. He says, if they come after you, they'll get you. We've all violated some rule or regulation or statute, and I only pleaded guilty to 2 counts to spare my family further ordeal and so forth. And again, I thought, but Danny, you're a crook. Okay, that remark was not appreciated at some of these tables. All right, more years passed, and I wrote a book referenced by Paul, Grafters and Goo-Goos, Corruption and Reform in Chicago. And my publisher takes me to lunch, and I had a throwaway line in that book, like, the political history of Chicago public schools would make a book in itself. He said, well, write that book. And without thinking, I said, no, that's not the story. George Ryan is the story. And actually, I hadn't covered Ryan since he was Secretary of State. I'd hardly thought about him. And he said, well, write that book. I said, oh, come on. How many crooked politicians do I have to write about? I mean, is this my existential task in life? I'm the crooked politics guy, and I want to write musical comedies. So, well, I'm being facetious. If George Ryan were just another crooked governor who went to jail, I wouldn't have bothered to write a book, and I don't know why you would bother to read it. He'll be remembered for single-handedly overturning the death penalty in Illinois, which is a radical act for a conservative Republican. But don't misunderstand me. George Ryan never said, they're out to get me, and they're especially out to get me because they don't like what I did with the death penalty. He never said that, but people in his orbit said as much. Well, Laura Lynn said that, Mrs. Ryan. So let's look at the corruption first. And people forget, George Ryan did not invent the Illinois Secretary of State's office. It's back in 1980. Secretary of State opens up, so Governor Ryan says, I'm going to appoint my young aide, Jim Edgar, to that job. What did I say? Governor Thompson appoints Jim Edgar as Secretary of State. And Edgar goes to Dan Webb, who was then Thompson's legal assistant, and he said, what am I getting into? Investigate that office for me. So Webb does, and he comes back and he says it's crooked. They sell driver's license. The inspectors shake down the trucking firms. The so-called investigators are all patronage hacks. And then 25 years later, Dan Webb defends George Ryan against those very same allegations. It was over the course of 25 years. Well, let's go back to November 8th, 1994. It's Election Day. George is running for re-election as Secretary of State. And so the Reverend Scott Willis and his wife, Janet, they piled their six of their kids, into a van. They're going to Wisconsin to visit an older son, but it's Election Day. They're conservative Republicans, so they stop to vote at the polling place first, and they vote for George Ryan, Secretary of State. They get outside Milwaukee. There's a semi-truck driven by a driver named Ricardo Guzman, who cannot speak English. He paid an $800 bribe to get his commercial driver's license at Melrose Park. And such money goes into Citizens for Ryan campaign fund. Now you think if you're going to endanger people's lives by putting unqualified truck drivers on the highway, you'd want more than $800. Our crooks are cheap. But he has a metal bracket dangling from the back of his truck. And other truckers try to warn him on CB radio, but he doesn't understand English. The weld fails, bracket hits the pavement, the Willis van drives over it, punctures the gas tank, boom. 6 kids die, and the 2 parents are badly injured. Now, I've seen people get emotional on both sides of this argument. They say, well, George Ryan is responsible for killing 6 kids. And others say, no, that's a cheap shot. George had nothing to do with that. Well, Laura Lynn said, George wasn't driving that truck. In any case, Ryan has never expressed any contrition or remorse, aside from the most pro forma statement of sorrow. So let's look at capital punishment. And again, I've seen people get emotional on both sides of this argument. That was obviously a cynical maneuver to influence the jury pool in Cook County that was going to try him, or that was a heartfelt, sincere gesture, and George should get the Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, the Nobel Peace Prize will be announced this Friday, and George has been nominated again. So, anyway, January of '99, George is inaugurated as governor. February of '99, a man named Andrew Porter is released from death row, Illinois death row. He was the 10th at that time inmate exonerated from death row. There are now 13 versus 12 executed since 1977. What happened was he scored 51 on an IQ test. So the Illinois Supreme Court said he probably does not understand what's going to happen to him or why. So they issued a stay for yet another competency hearing, and the delay gave the Center for Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University and Northwestern journalism students time to investigate the case, and incredibly, they found the real killer. The real killer confessed to them, so they let Porter out of jail, and George is lying on bed at the mansion. This is back when governors lived in the mansion. George is lying next to Laura Lynn, and he's watching Channel 9 News, and he sees Anthony Porter released it. So he says to Laura Lynn, how the hell could that happen in America? You know, this man was on death row for 15 years, and the legal system, with all its checks and balances and due process, didn't free this man. Journalism students did. Journalism students. He had a low opinion of journalists and journalism students. Well, who doesn't? But there's another month passes, and the first capital case crosses his desk. He'd hardly ever thought about the death penalty. He was for it, in the sense that he was for the Republican law and order platform. But now he has somebody's life or death is in his hand, a man named Andrew Kokorales. And if you're a proponent of the death penalty, you could not invent a more worthy candidate for the ultimate punishment than Andrew Kokorales. He was a member of a satanic cult. They kidnapped women, mutilated them, tortured them, killed them. It is a horrible, horrible man. And his appeals are exhausted, so George goes to sign the writ of execution, and he can't do it. So he has somebody write up the papers for a 90-day stay, and he goes to sign that. Can't sign it. He turns back to the writ. He totally freaked out. He freaked out more that night than the day he got indicted, I think. Well, finally he decides the man is undoubtedly guilty, and all due process has been followed, and I am sworn to uphold the law. So he signs the warrant, and they shoot him up, and he dies. Now, not quite another year passes, and Jim Ryan, the Attorney General, calls him. He says, well, Governor, we've got these guys on death row, and they've exhausted all their appeals, so we need to set some DOEs. DOEs? Dates of execution, Governor. He says, I don't think so. Hold off on that. I might have something to say. And immediately, he called a news conference, said, I'm declaring a moratorium on executions, and I'm appointing this Blue Ribbon Commission to study the issue, and they'll come back and recommend remedies. And so that led to the, ultimately blanket commutation. And I was interviewing him after the trial, and I said a stock kind of journalistic question. I said, Governor, what was your biggest mistake? And he said, yeah, what was your biggest mistake? I killed a man. Just like that. By killing a man, he meant Andrew Kokorales. So to go back to that commission, this indirectly led to hearings by Illinois Prisoner Review Board. Every capital case in Illinois, just gut-wrenching scenes, family members of murder victims accosting defense attorneys, and people weeping, these horror scenes. And George had all these hearings piped into his office, and nobody would give an inch. There was no state's attorney from any county in Illinois who would say, well, maybe this is an issue we should look at. No, they just said he's guilty, kill him. And George he simply did not trust prosecutors, and the more he saw this, the more he distrusted them, because he thought they were out to get his friends. So sure enough, the commission meets, and it comes back, and it has 80-some recommendations. So was Ryan a cynic, or was this an honest conviction? My position is not the truth lies somewhere in between. I don't think either position understands George Ryan, the politician. He was a professional politician, and he reacted professionally. He saw this broken down system, And capital punishment is, after all, a government program. He saw this broken program, and he said, what do I do? I'll appoint a blue ribbon commission. They'll come back. That will give me political cover to take these changes to the General Assembly. So 3 times he presented that package to the legislature. 3 times they said, no, forget it. It was an election year, and nobody's going to call them soft on crime. That's part of what I was getting at in the subtitle, The Politics of Crime. Now he's running out of time. He's close to stepping down from office. He couldn't have been reelected. I mean, there were, at some point early in 2001, I'd say he couldn't be reelected no matter how much money he raised. So he's stepping down. The legislature won't act. He's got this, he says, I have one recourse left to me. I have the constitutional power to pardon crimes and commute sentences, and I will exercise that power. Now, looked at in that light, maybe it wasn't such a radical act. That was George being George. He was exercising power, which he loved to do. He spent his lifetime doing it. Maybe it was an act of moral vanity. I don't know. But his motivations? What were his motives? I don't know what was in his heart, but I asked him, Governor, did there come a moment when you knew that you were going to be indicted? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, they're indicting all your friends left and right. You must have thought they're coming after me. And he said, no, I never believed I was going to be indicted until Dan Webb called me with the news. And I thought, well, his conviction's still under appeal, so he's just maintaining a posture of innocence, and I understand that. But the more I studied the man and his career, he truly did not believe that his activities were criminal. And he's not alone in that. Many of our indicted public officials just express bewilderment. You know, this is against the law. Now, I know this sounds crazy. If he didn't know he was going to be indicted, he was the only person in Illinois who didn't know it. But I would think that he wasn't trying to snooker a jury because he actually didn't believe that he would be indicted, or if indicted, convicted. Now, that thought was certainly in Dan Webb's mind. That's on the record. Dan Webb said, when a jury hears what this man did with the death penalty system, they can't possibly convict him of the crimes of which he's charged. Well, the judge said, that won't be part of this trial. So, 6 kids die because of a crooked licensing system. And then everybody gets out of death row. Now, what do these stories have in common? I am not responsible for death. Blood is not on my George Ryan's hands. I don't kill people. I didn't kill those kids. I don't execute convicts. Anyway, that's my theory. But because it's just my theory, I didn't put it in the book. The book is documented. So you get a bonus for coming here today. You get a bonus, my theory. There's another issue I'm often asked about. Did George Ryan get a fair trial? Early on during the trial, I was having lunch with a source at Gene and Giorgetti's, fount of political gossip, except for this room, of course. And the source says the judge had gone to a Bar Association luncheon at Plymouth Court, and she said, I am getting that case out of my court. If I'm overturned on appeal, I've been overturned before, but I'm getting that case out of my court. And I thought, well, that's interesting. No way I could ever confirm that remark for my book. What am I going to do? Call her up? Judge, did you say? Oh, yes, I said that. Thank you. But then she said as much from the bench, or not from the bench, in chambers with the opposing counsel. When the transcripts finally were released, she says, if I'm reversed, I've been reversed before, but we're going to get a verdict. Now, I don't know, short of actual gunfire, I don't know what that jury could have done to provoke a mistrial. They couldn't send out for pizza. Literally, they broke into 2 caucuses for lunch. So did Ryan get a fair trial? United States Court of Appeals for the 7th District said he did. So I take their word for it. But if I had been a defendant in that trial, I would have a different opinion. So that's my understanding of the life and times of George Ryan and what we call our culture of corruption. And I learned the most from these events from your questions. So I'd be curious to hear your questions. We don't do the microphones anymore? It's just...
No, this is like the press club in Washington. We'll do these, and I will circle among you. All right, Joyce Saxon with seniority.
I am honored to have the first question from Joyce Saxon.
What are you running for? All right, here we go. So polite. City Club, how many released death row, if any, have committed new crimes since release? Do you have that number?
You know, I don't know the number to that, but he pardoned 4 people. Actually 7, but everybody's forgotten 3 from the previous December before the January. So he pardoned 4 people and commuted sentences of 167 others. I don't know, some undoubtedly committed crimes. I don't know how many, but I do know this created a terrible problem for prison administrators because they let the worst psychopathic killers out into the general prison population. And that's tough. Nobody's commented on that.
This is from Ms. Posner, our
Yes.
recovering from her slight, looking pretty good. Yes. Because you are the self-proclaimed author, well, he is the author, not self-proclaimed, of the books on corrupt Illinois politicians, have you started your research on, do I have to give the name? Blagojevich.
You know, people ask me that. That would be redundant. It was like, I guess I could just submit the same manuscript. He's public official A. I could just submit the same manuscript and do a search and replace on the computer. Wherever it says Ryan, say Blagojevich. So there you have the book.
I have Paul Green's question. I'll read it from my hands. How hard was it for you to get to interview Governor Ryan? Because from your talk, and I know I read the book in manuscript, I also know my memory is not what it used to be. Did you talk to him before the final verdict as well as after the final verdict?
Well, if you want to get to George Ryan.
And why did he agree?
Well, I'm such a nice guy.
Move on. Next read.
If you want to get to George Ryan, you have to make a deal. So I would talk to him during breaks in the trial in the hallways, but it was just off the record. And I said, when this is over, I'm writing a book, so I hope we can sit down and talk. He said, well, I don't know because I'm trying to make my own book and movie deals. Again, just like Danny Rostenkowski. That's the first thing Danny told me. So after the trial, I said, can we talk? And George and Laura Lynn take a driving tour of Civil War battlefields. And he's on the way home, he calls up the editor of his hometown paper, the Kankakee Daily News. He says, well, that jury just made a mistake, and we'll get it fixed on appeal. I'm not worried. So Dan Webb calls him up and chews him out. He says, stop talking to the media because sentencing judges want to hear some expression of contrition, and you're saying, stop doing that. So I said, all right, we can't talk about the legal case. So we'll take that off the table, but I can ask you anything else about your life story. And he's a politician, he's egotistical, he wants to tell his life story. So he tells me about growing up on his granddaddy's farm and et cetera, et cetera. So I did interview George Ryan, but not about the case, the charges he was convicted on.
Real quick,
Yes.
Wait a minute. Yes, Mr. Pinka and then Mr. Coca-Cola.
Is George Ryan, what's he doing now, or is he anticipating that George Bush, upon departure, will become a pardon in the spring?
For our vast TV audience, Ms. Topinka wanted to know what Mr. Ryan is doing now. Probably behind bars, but, but elaborate.
Is he anticipating a pardon?
I was looking for Mr. Cook. He's not here today, right? The editor of the Sun-Times. When is Mike Snead going to get the first jailhouse interview? Well, Homer, George Ryan Jr., he recently visits his dad in Terre Haute, and he says, "Dad, you know, the press wants to talk to you." And George looks at him, "Are you crazy?" He says, I'm not going to say anything that might jeopardize a pardon because they'll just say he's still not contrite. I don't think it will happen because you remember Ryan went to Cuba, and George Bush was governor of Texas, and Jeb Bush was governor of Florida with that huge Cuban-American constituency, and they were outraged that a Republican governor went to visit a communist dictator, Fidel Castro. So there's no warmth between President Bush and George Bush. Whether he will go crazy with midnight pardons just before leaving office, like Bill Clinton did, I don't know. And as far as that goes, if Barack gets in there, Barack could commute the sentence to time served. Say he's an old man, he's sick, he's paid his price, and so forth. So, Judy, the answer is I don't know.
Yes, real loud.
Okay, John Rosales from the Coca-Cola Company. You mentioned in your speech about Jim Edgar and how he asked Dan Webb to check out the position before he took the position that he actually took.
Right.
So, in your opinion, did Jim Edgar clean up that house, or was it low key, and then George Ryan had kind of ramped it up under his administration?
Repeat the question briefly.
Jim Edgar asked Dan Webb to look into the Secretary of State's office, so when Jim Edgar was Secretary of State, did he clean it up? What's my opinion? My opinion is no, he did not. I'm not saying he's guilty of anything. I'm just saying that's a historically corrupt operation. And there's such scattered field offices, I mean, I don't know how you could superintend or police it all. But let's remember during the 1990s, when Edgar was Secretary of State, Thompson was governor. I'm sorry. You talk about your memory. During the 80s, Edgar Secretary of State, Thompson is governor. Thompson controls the Illinois Attorney General. He controls the 3 U.S. attorneys in Illinois. He controls the U.S. attorneys in the Republican counties. There weren't any prosecutors eager to investigate the Secretary of State's office. And I obtained some information which I could not put in the book. I'll leave it at that. Yes?
I just want to light on the same question. In your research, was there anything you discovered that George Ryan instituted in that office that dramatically changed the criminality from what he inherited from Jim Edgar?
The CDLs, commercial driver's license. It happened. Did George Ryan institute any avenue of criminality, correct? Mr. Horst. Their CDLs, commercial driver's license, had been sold. What happened was in the 90s, you would think this had nothing to do with it, but communism collapsed. The Iron Curtain fell. America gets all these immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they need to get jobs, so they become truck drivers. So middlemen and trucking firms and so forth they ran these pools of immigrant truck drivers through these driving schools, and they got fake CDLs, not only in Illinois, but in Florida. So you could say it's a matter of degree, but it was so much worse under Ryan, I think it amounted to a matter of a difference in kind, not just degree.
Why do you think Ryan's viewpoint on the death penalty was relevant in his criminal trial? Repeat the question.
Why do I think Ryan's viewpoint on the death penalty was relevant at the criminal trial? Did I say that? No, his defense attorney, Dan Webb, thought it was relevant. And he said there's no way a jury will convict a man who showed so much compassion and humanitarianism. And the judge said, and the prosecution wanted to bring up the 6 kids in the fireball in Illinois. And the judge said, No CDL accidents, no death penalty. Irrelevant, not germane, the jury won't hear it. Now, what did that jury really hear? We don't know.
Anyone else? Yes, repeat the question.
Do I have a personal opinion on the death penalty? Any CEOs in this room? There were 13 people exonerated versus 12 executed since 1977. Could your business stand a 13 to 12 failure to success ratio? I mean, think about that. So my personal opinion is I'm against it not on moral grounds, but because it's unworkable. There's no possible way it can be uniform and justly applied.
Couple more. Judy.
Just a quickie. Governor Blagojevich at this point has not moved on them, has about 1,500 issues from the Prisoner Review Board in terms of letting people out, death penalty. I mean, all of these things need to be acted on. He has not acted upon them for 7 years, 6 years. Is there anything that this book or you or the press can do to encourage that there be some action taken? Or, because this, the good, the bad, and the ugly is in that mass. So there's people sitting there who should be let out, people who should be put away for life, probably people who should die.
Repeat that. Should be easy.
Judy, what were you thinking? I used to, when I was a reporter, I used to get in trouble for being facetious. My apologies. The question was, there are many people still serving maximum sentences and sentenced to death. What did you say, 1,500? That are pending before Governor Blagojevich, and he has taken no action. Something else, I mentioned the problems for prisoner administrators. It's possible that a few of these people who were sentenced to life in prison actually might have been exonerated, might have won a retrial and been exonerated or at least gotten a lesser sentence. It's possible that some of those got worse deals under the blanket commutation than they could have gotten working the system. I don't know, it's speculation. But as far as Governor Blagojevich, the governor, nobody wants, this is the politics of crime. Nobody wants to touch it. Nobody, and he'll just let the system clog and back up, I predict, until we get the next governor. And on that point, one of the criticisms of Ryan's action was, well, he's just trying to do something popular. Gain favor in the opinion polls. If it was so popular, why has no other governor done the same thing? Nobody. Right? Alderman.
How would you rate George Ryan's performance as governor, at least compared to other governors in your lifetime?
Well, rate Ryan's performance in office compared to other governors. A quick story to illustrate. Of course, it's 99. This is the height of the dot-com boom. Economy's flush. State revenues are flowing in. And so Ryan says, we're going to have a capital program. Was it $12 billion? Yes. $12 billion bond issue. So he goes to meet with Pate and the other legislative leaders, and Pate says, Governor, we might go to $10 billion. I don't see any way we can go to 12. So George slams his briefing book shut, says, gentlemen, it will be $12 billion or nothing, and he walks out of the room. And he got his $12 billion. Who won that showdown with Pate, So he was an effective governor. He had served as speaker and lieutenant governor. He understood how to work the legislature better than his predecessor, Jim Edgar, or his successor, Rod Blagojevich. To compare him with Jim Thompson, who served 14 years, I would say Thompson's in a class by himself. I wouldn't try to make that comparison.
Marty.
Is there anything that the governor could have done or his defense to won that case rather than lost it, in your opinion? Any master stroke?
I think the evidence, could Ryan have done anything? I've been hoping Mr. Collins might have a question. So, could Ryan have done anything to have won that case? I think the evidence was overwhelming that he had committed the crimes as charged. He was charged with 18 counts. Some of them involved mail fraud and wire fraud, which bother me. I'm not saying this U.S. Attorney's Office has done anything untoward or anything wrong, but I'm saying that power is there for prosecutors if prosecutors want to use it, and some have. Could Ryan have done anything? Pure speculation, not in the book. Oh, well, he was, some of his defenders offered the country hick defense. You know, I'm just a pharmacist from Kankakee, and I was taken advantage of by these city slickers. You know, well, guys like Larry Warner and others. Well, all his life has surrounded himself with thugs. So you don't do that. Why would you do that unless you're somewhat of a thug yourself? I mean, I'm not here today to defend George Ryan. But what could he have done? Pure speculation, and if you quote me on this, I'll deny it. He could have done one thing. He could have said, I'll give you Jim Thompson. I will give you Jim Thompson. I retract that. In other words, he didn't have a case.
Last question from Mr. Will County. Go ahead, Mike.
A question in this whole period of time that has come to me a lot is the connection with how we fund political campaigns in Illinois and the Jackson decree, which handcuffs the people who hold office from firing crooks for incompetence or competence, I guess. And I believe that they're interconnected, and that had a lot to do with the background of that Willis problem in the Secretary of State's office, which has been a cesspool for a very long time. And you can't fire them anymore.
Yes, if the voters will never get a shot at me, but if I were ever to run for office, I would run as the unreformer. I'm going to undo. See, every wave of reform, they say, well, statutes and regulations haven't worked, so let's write some more of them. And let's keep writing them until we get it right. Well, every wave of reform builds in more institutional pathologies, like people who can't be fired. So, yes, that is part of the problem.
How about a round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Now, before you go,
Where's my book?
hold it, Jim, before you go. The book is available at